you see these traditions being tossed aside in this moment of experimentation.
It became the in thing to lose control.
People actually liked rubbing elbows with gangsters.
The mystique of the era was the license and the freedom to do whatever made you feel good. The clubs, the speakeasies,
Bootleggers and gangsters.
Showgirls, jazz, dance.
I think it's the decade that really defines this country more than anything else in the 20th century.
I think the phrase the money decade is a very useful way of describing the 20s, actually. It's a time when suddenly money seems free and available and it's being easily spent. And I think it probably does reflect a kind of hunger or appetite for money, fast living, excess, expenditure. There was certainly a sense in the 20s that anything could happen, a kind of unlimited potential.
I'm expanding my business.
And Nucky Thompson.
Things are changing in Atlantic City.
back in the 20s, after World War I, people were feeling real good about themselves. The nation was feeling real good about itself. World War I was a huge chapter in American history because 11 million people died in World War I, and we were the decisive factor in bringing about peace, and American society felt very confident about itself. And when you combine that victory with some of the things that were happening in society, we had radio and telephone. Communication was now instantaneous. You have the phonograph and you have the moving pictures. And then, the automobile. It not only freed people to move wherever they want, but also very quickly evolved into a thing of status in the type of car that you owned. So when you combine those things, the 20s was a hot time. Well, the 1920s was a very complex period. We call it the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. So the 20s is one of those eras in American history where there's tremendous experimentation, cynicism about traditional values. So there's tremendous social change taking place.
Nelson, he was offering alcohol.
I realize that, dear.
Well, aren't you going to arrest him?
Prohibition was a noble but foolish experiment, and it was doomed to failure.
To those beautiful, ignorant bastards.
What it did was, spawned a whole generation of criminals who were able to make money from the sale of a beverage that people weren't going to do without. It was a real opportunity for organized crime.
Prohibition was the single event that really made millionaires out of gangsters.
Tough out there, Chicago? The liquor trade?
It's tough all over, I'd imagine. There's a lot of dough at stake.
How's Torrio handling the competition?
We're killing them.
Without Prohibition, there's no Al Capone. There's no Lucky Luciano. There's no Nucky Thompson. Prohibition gave these guys a chance to be more legitimate, in a way, which is ironic when you think about it, because before they were two-bit thugs. They were bouncers and bartenders and safecrackers, pickpockets, and now they're delivering a service that respectable people want and will pay for. So it's a step up in the world to become a bootlegger.
How dirty is this town, Nuck?
Is there an honest man in Atlantic City?
Is there a sober reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer?
Be news to me.
The people didn't really look down their noses at people who continued to drink. Some segments of society did, but for the most part, Prohibition was largely ignored by people, and the people who broke that law weren't really looked upon badly.
Really because of Prohibition, because it made it more dangerous, a little bit more sexy. Now women were starting to drink in public too, really for the first time.
Women began looking at themselves very differently. They saw themselves as free players in the society who were able to do, things that men could do.
Drinking alone? Drinking at all?
Prohibition was probably one of the better examples in American history of what I call the law of unintended consequences, which is you can set out to do something that's very good and you can achieve your goal, and then one of the products that you did not foresee, unintended, was something that undermines your goal.
I think this show offers a really interesting and fairly accurate emotional portrayal of these real gangsters, Capone, Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Rothstein, and Nucky Thompson.
Arnold Rothstein in 1921, he's really at the height of his power, both as a crime figure and a gambler. Rothstein won some major horse racing bets in 21.
It's unorthodox, yes, but there's nothing illegal about it.
Said the spider to the fly. Capone, Lansky, and Luciano at this point are still fledgling gangsters. And in the very near future, Luciano and Lansky will introduce drugs.
But thinking of getting into heroin.
When you run the numbers, it starts looking very attractive.
They are incredibly ambitious. It isn't too far in the future that they will all make moves.
Nucky Thompson, Johnny Torrio, Rothstein, Waxy Gordon. They have problems. They come to us.
Exactly why we don't need them.
At this point, Torrio is handing over more responsibility to Capone.
Capone sort of almost moved into middle management. Torrio's smart enough to start taking him in as a partner.
Go see Nucky. Tell him things have changed.
Well, that's it? He'll think of something.
These are young, desperate guys who will do anything to get ahead. And, you juxtapose that against somebody like Nucky who, obviously is capable of doing some desperate things, but he's got it already. He's got the money, he's got the power.
Prohibition provided this incredible opportunity for Nucky and his friends, but now he's in many ways a target because he's in a position of power and there's always someone that's going to want what he has.
And to the victors go the spoils.
To women in the 20s, these guys were incredibly powerful, incredibly suave, incredibly dashing. I talked to women who met the Capone boys and traveled with the mob and dated in them and fell in love with them and in some cases married them. And they say you could not believe how charming they were. That, I was this 22-year-old girl. I had nothing going for me but my looks. It was an incredibly fun era to be in. I wasn't giving a single thought yet to life and what I was going to be when I grew up. And along came these incredibly handsome, incredibly wealthy men who just swept you off your feet. And they describe who we think of as being these big tough thugs as being incredibly charming.
I'm sorry we met.
Well, not exactly, but everyone knows who the new king is.
Well, the gangsters were exclusively from the working class. These were men who worked their way up from very difficult circumstances. If they worked beforehand, they worked at hard labor, which paid very poorly, maybe in factories or in sweatshops. So their transformation into wealthy people in the 20s was almost magical.
You're not the biggest crook I've been seen in public with, Lewis.
Wish I could say the same about you.
Are we shocking your youthful sensibilities?
I've heard worse, sir.
Jimmy went up against the Kaiser for 2 years.
Oh, that's a rough patch of road.
That was only war. This is Atlantic City.
These are guys who really saw themselves as businessmen. In some cases, they saw themselves as businessmen first, and organizers of illegal operations second.
Thought you was a businessman.
Just give me the straight dope, all right?
Maya thinks we should talk.
It was a great time of awakening. It's really, in many ways, as a result of Prohibition, as a result of these speakeasies, you see the birth of modern America.
Speakeasies defined any place where illegal liquor was sold and consumed.
There are certainly accounts describing what fun it was to go down the hidden staircase and give the password to the guy who was sitting behind the grill and be ushered into this candlelit room where you were drinking bootleg gin out of teacups. And this was definitely part of its appeal, the sort of louche glamour, the idea that you were rubbing shoulders with gangsters.
So speakeasies were everywhere. It was estimated in 1929 that there were as many as 70,000 speakeasies in New York City alone.
Just as there are different places to go nowadays to get a drink, there's your dive bars and there's your high-class places. I imagine it was the same with speakeasies as well. There's your little hole in the wall, or there's the fancy clubs that are hidden away as well.
The nightclubs, of course, brought in intimate entertainment, girly shows, as well as jazz bands and dance acts, anything, of course, that would keep the customers there, enjoying the liquor as long as possible.
The champagne okay?
Good news, just isn't the same without it.
These clubs became very sexy, romantic places to be. And often it was the gangsters themselves or their families or their friends who were running the best of those speakeasies because they could afford to bring in the best music and the best booze. And you'd have casinos in the basement oftentimes or in the back room. You'd have brothels upstairs with women for hire. And this became the great center of American culture in the 1920s.
There was a real sort of excitement that was quite new in speakeasies, in jazz clubs, that has to do with all the elements, with Prohibition, with gangsters, with jazz, with dance, with the 20s itself as a sort of self-confident decade.
Jazz was a huge part of what people went out for. Obviously drinking was another big part of it. And I think part of the mystique of the era is that people were having a good time. They really knew how to party in the 20s.
The songs from the 1920s are written, of course, in a very jazzy and ragtimey style. And I call it a hybrid era. The ragtime era was fading away, but still there. And the jazz era was starting to blossom. So you had this mixture, and I call it ragga jazz. A little bit of ragtime, a little bit of jazz.
Jazz exploded in the 20s at the same time that this underground culture of drinking was beginning, and jazz had that same edge to it. It was forbidden in many places. And you had black musicians playing for white audiences. In some cases you had black and white musicians playing together, something you would never have heard previously. And I think it happens in part because of the speakeasy operators, because of these bootleggers and gangsters who are willing to try new things.
Atlantic City's nightclub scene was integrated years before anybody thought of integration. And it simply was the culture. And again, if you look at Nucky and you look at his relationship with the black community, there was nothing that he would do to ever have them think that somehow they weren't important to him, because they were terribly important to him. They were the mainstay of his voter base.
Mr. White, say hello to Harry Price.
Get a load of that.
Chalky White, the proprietor.
Quite a place, sir.
The gangsters actually allowed jazz to develop because what they wanted out of music in their clubs was up-tempo, fun, danceable music. And if the musicians were providing it, they were pretty hands-off. And so the musicians actually enjoyed playing at gangster-run jazz clubs because nobody was telling them what to play. And so there's a quote from a musician saying, the worse the place was, meaning kind of morally and ethically, the better it was to play. So there is a very important, oddly, relationship between gangsters, jazz clubs, and the music itself.